everybody, and welcome to episode 79 of On the Road with AutoTrader, where we make car stuff simple for Canadians. My name is Jodi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of AutoTrader.
And my name is Dan Alika, and I'm AutoTrader's road test editor, and happy to be back.
Welcome
once
back.
again. Now, last time I missed an episode was because I was sick. This time it was just like so crazy busy. I was on the road a bunch.
Tell the good people what you were driving.
I don't even remember. No.
Everything's a blur.
What was I driving?
GTI?
Oh, maybe it was the 2025 Volkswagen Golf GTI and Golf R. So it's like refreshed, very subtle. Like unless you are a diehard, you probably wouldn't notice. The biggest changes are the infotainment, and the most important change is the volume. The haptic controls for the volume and the temperature are still haptic controls, which I don't love. So they're like sliders, and you put your finger on them and move it up and down. But the problem is they weren't backlit,
so you couldn't see them at night.
Yeah. So when the Mark 8 Golf launched, they had these haptic controls that weren't backlit. So as soon as it was dark, you wouldn't know what you were doing. And then the steering wheel also had haptic controls. The Golf R still has that steering wheel, apparently because Volkswagen wanted to keep the R button, so the drive mode button on the steering wheel. However, first of all, it's like, I don't think that's a big deal, because there are two other ways to cycle through the drive modes in the vehicle. Yeah, that seems like a weird
excuse.
And as soon as we were on the track, I activated the heated steering wheel by accident. I turned up the volume on the stereo entirely by accident. And yes, that is a very unique circumstance to be in, but that's also what that car was designed to do.
Totally.
So as I put it in the review, like when you have busy hands, it's very easy. And, respectfully, some guy on YouTube who owns a Mark 8 Golf, so of course he's going to jump to its defense.
Of course.
Tell me it's not that bad. And then was like, well, why don't you wear gloves? And it's like, dude, I'm not like, I know I've seen carters and stuff wear gloves, but it's like, I'm not going out in a full fire suit and whatever. Like a track day, if you're taking your car to a Saturday open lapping day, yeah, you need to wear a helmet. That's a absolute no-brainer. You should probably even be wearing a Hans device. But I'm less judgmental of others if you choose not to do that. But to be like, yeah, I'm putting my gloves on so I don't activate the heated steering wheel in my car is like, that's one of those solutions that shouldn't be the solution.
Yeah, because the solution is just to have a better design.
Yeah, but I also understand Volkswagen, kind of reading between the lines of why the GTI has the new steering wheel that has hard buttons because it doesn't have that drive mode selector. Volkswagen isn't going to spend a bunch of money on a very low volume car. So they're not going to develop a new steering wheel with physical buttons just for the Golf R. But they should have just got rid of, like, they should have gone to the same steering wheel as the GTI and just said, well, now there's no more drive mode button on the left side.
But there's
of the
other ways
wheel.
To do it
exactly.
Anyway. Yeah, it doesn't really make sense.
But getting off topic here, but I'm glad that Sebastian, aka my substitution, did another great job. And he's really, I know you praised him a lot, and so I don't want to do this too much because he's such a skinny guy, and that big head would look really funny on that.
He'll just fall right over
on that skinny body. But he did such a great job with the tariff stuff. He's really knowledgeable. I mean, Seb's a smart guy and knows his stuff, but when he sinks his teeth into something, he like really owns it. And I think with all of the tariff stuff going on, he's done such a great job. And that episode, anyone out there who's listening or watching that hasn't checked out the previous episode about kind of what could these tariffs do to the auto industry in Canada, if you really want a great snapshot of the situation, and some speculation, Jodi and Sebastian absolutely nailed that.
Seb did so much research for that podcast, and he wrote a subsequent article about it, but it also goes back into history to tell you like how we got to this point now, and it was a fascinating job by him.
It's funny because the AutoPact thing, I had written a little bit about last year with Toyota's history in Canada. So it's just funny. And the fact that Stephen Beattie, who is a former VP at Toyota Canada, who's like a very knowledgeable guy too. It was just funny to like listen to the podcast and read the story and be reminded of how impactful the AutoPact was for the industry in Canada.
Game changer.
But, again, getting off topic, and, we're 5 minutes in at this point, but If there were ever any doubts, and I know we don't really like to get political, but it's like if there were ever any doubts about what the point of these tariffs were to damage our economy and other economies, it's like now look at the Trump coming out and saying that movies and TV shows produced outside of the U.S. are going to be hit with 100% tariff, which I don't really even understand how that would work.
You can't do services. It doesn't work that way.
How do you so what are you going to say? Oh, the movies in theater are going to be tariffed. Well, once again, that's a tariff on consumer because, no movie chain or streaming service is going to say, okay, well, we'll just eat that extra cost. But like Canada is, I'm pretty sure the largest film and television production for the English language in particular, and for kind of, we're referred to as Hollywood North in Toronto and Vancouver.
Yeah.
But it's like these are attacks on our collective, livelihood and our economy, just like the automotive tariffs. And it's like very concerning to watch someone, wield so much power and do so in such a kind of like
a damaging but also very flippant way.
Yeah.
Like he'll just say something that could derail our entire economy so casually.
Yeah. So anyways, aside from that, the negative, the good news is that Sebastian really knows what he's talking about, and I'm glad that he did that episode. Anyways, it kind of worked out that I wasn't available. This episode is a much different topic.
Yeah, I feel like this is a very much like a back to basics of Own the Road. So when we first started this show, 80 episodes ago, 79 episodes, we talked a lot about like basic car knowledge. Because we're making car stuff simple. And so this came up recently because you are in the middle of shopping for a new car.
Well, to be honest with you, it wasn't even my search that kind of, prompted this idea. But it was more so conversations with other people, including, my friend Jeff Crane, who's a loyal listener.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about his parents were in the market for a new vehicle, and we just got down this kind of rabbit hole of like, giving advice to friends and family. Even for him, like he's a very knowledgeable when it comes to vehicles, and he's a huge Jeep fan. And like his sister wanted a new vehicle and was like, "Oh, I want to buy a Jeep, like a new JL," and he was like, "Yeah, I wouldn't. It's not right for you." And she went ahead and did it anyways. And then it's like, the common gripes with the Jeep about it's loud, it's uncomfortable. It's cold in the winter because she has a soft top. Like there are all of those things that he's like, yeah, but that's why I told you not to buy it.
But she ended up doing it because it was like a really...
Well, just because she thought it was cool, right?
Right.
And so that's this whole kind of idea of shopping with your head and not your heart. And I know it's easier said than done. So we're not here to, to throw shade at anyone or to shame you for your purchase decision. But I guess what we want to talk about is when and why you should, prioritize, using your brain and being like, look, I really want car A, but I know car B is the more practical choice for my life.
Yeah. And so I feel like cars can be a very emotional purchase for a lot of people. A, because it's so much money, but I also feel like because it's such, it can be an expression of like who you are,
Absolutely.
what you do. And so it can be very emotional, like the clothes you wear, right? Yeah. And so for people who see cars as more than just like an appliance to get from A to B, I think this is a very heavy decision for a lot of people that we go back and forth on all the time.
Well, I think like a good example of, this debate kind of, just something that happens with a lot of people is another friend named Jeff. And I promise you, this isn't me just, making it up and using like a pseudonym for the same, friend. This is a different guy named Jeff. He and his wife have 4 kids.
Oh my God.
4 daughters. All of them are, I'm pretty sure now they're still all under the age of 10, or maybe they're just at that. But anyways, regardless, they're
busy
4
family.
Young kids, and they needed a replacement vehicle for their Acura MDX, which, was already getting kind of tight. And they bought a certified pre-owned Volvo XC90, which, if Jeff and Shannon, like it it makes, you're like, I can see you guys driving it. Like, it makes a lot of sense from, their personalities.
Okay.
They're very sensible people. They fit with the brand. However, I said to him, like, you should really be looking at a minivan, and he was like, yeah, like Shannon's friend has one who also has some young kids, and is just like, she hates driving it, is super, self-conscious about it, whatever. And, Shannon, and whatever, to each their own, but Shannon had said, I'm not that kind of person. But I'm like, but my response to it is like, but you are. Maybe you don't want to be that kind of person, but when you have 4 kids, you're a minivan person.
Well, so I was going to say, like, the Volvo is not that much bigger than the MDX that they're replacing it with, right? So that to me is a sideways move. You should be leveling up.
Yeah. I don't know. And that's why this is a prime example.
Minivans especially, I think, because people are so self-conscious about, like, oh, I don't want to appear to be uncool in front of all these people. Yeah.
I mean, we've had Carl Bonner. They bought and granted, they only have two boys. But, when his parents are in town, when they visit from Ireland, or he's got a brother that lives in Chicago who has, a family, and they come up to Toronto to visit. So I said to him, I was like, you guys should probably look at the Sienna. And he was like, no, can't do it. And granted, they bought the Grand Highlander, which is decently sized, but it's still one of those things where I'm like, I don't know, the whole cool thing. We've talked about it before, minivans are uncool and all this stuff. But I'm like, does that really matter? And what I've asked this question, like, what suddenly makes an SUV cool?
I don't know. Maybe it's because all your friends would be in our generation, right? And so when we were growing up, minivans were like very uncool because all of our parents had one. Like my family had a minivan.
Yeah, but they were uncool to you as a child.
I liked my minivans.
No, I don't mean you in general. Like I'm saying people, like our generation. It's like maybe I didn't care. I thought our van, we had a Chevy Lumina, and I thought it was cool. The Dustbuster van,
So cool.
And it's just that sure, there was like a stigma about it, but I'm like, if you grow up, like I guess it's funny to me that, the things, I've said this to parents before, the things that parents will do publicly and have absolutely no shame about. And I'm not judging them for it again, but it's like, they will do some pretty, like, I guess like boundary pushing stuff with their kids and not care about it, whatever. But then it's like, oh, but you won't catch me dead driving a van.
That's so
like,
crazy to me because it is so practical. Like, I think about how much easier these people's lives would be with the right tool for the right job, right?
This is how I don't really want to. I want to save my car buying thing to do like a dedicated episode about my shopping experience. Right now, I'm in the market for a replacement for my Golf wagon. I want to buy new, and a lot of that has to do with warranty and stuff like that. But quite honestly, if the Ford Transit Connect, so the small Transit, was still in production, that would be on my short list. And I don't have kids, and I seldom have more than one other person with me, and that's Becky. But because of, going biking and stuff, it would be nice to have all that space inside.
Totally.
So
and you go camping,
exactly.
So you sleep in it.
So it's like, I know that's kind of, let's say, minivan adjacent. It's not a minivan, but it's like, I don't care. I don't go, oh, people are going to look at me funny. It's like, well,
I think you have a certain level of confidence that not everybody has.
But I'm just like, what are you, so that's why one of the vehicles that I talk a lot about for people that are like so just convinced that they need a pickup truck, really, I would so highly recommend the Ford Maverick. And this is one of those vehicles that I thought of instantly when Jeff and I started talking about car shopping, and I thought about, using your head and not your heart. It's kind of both.
Right.
Because if in your heart you really, really want a pickup, but in your head you're like, yeah, I'm not really going to use it, the Maverick does check the box of, it can pull 4,000 pounds.
Yep. Open bed.
But I drove the hybrid. So the Maverick is really good. We've liked it at AutoTrader since it launched. Every one of our contributors loves it. It just won Best Overall Truck in the 2025
That's a repeat win, too.
AutoTrader Awards. And one of the big kind of things that's pushed it over the edge, because it hasn't changed that much since it launched back in 2022, I believe it was. But now the hybrid version, which was previously front-wheel drive only, is now available with all-wheel drive. And when I drove it on the first drive event, we were, on winding roads outside of San Diego. They were pretty hilly. It wasn't like we were just on a straight stretch of road. And hybrids do better in town than they do on the highway. And I had an indicated average of like 5.9 liters per 100 kilometers.
For a truck, that's amazing.
And yes, I know that was only a couple guys in the truck, no payload, no trailer on the back. But the point being that the circumstances that you are going to use it most, you are going to have this very efficient vehicle, but you're still getting that traction. Mm-hmm. You're still getting the practicality of a pickup truck.
Yeah.
So but just in a better package.
And you don't end up having to compromise that much because you still get everything you want. But it's cheaper to run, easier to maneuver around and park. It's really not a compromise at all.
Yeah. So, I think those are probably like the two greatest examples of, head over heart purchase decisions. A minivan for a family who needs space, and a Maverick for a person who wants a pickup truck but probably doesn't need one all the time. But, conversely, looking at it, and you've talked about this before, like when you drove the Acura Integra Type S, you loved it. Now, yeah, it's kind of practical because it's that lift back style and whatever, but that was a heart, not a head decision,
that was very much a heart decision. So whenever I test drive a car that I absolutely love, and it's usually something like a luxury leaning sport compact, just because that's the kind of car I personally love and it just fits into my life really well. And the Type S being one of the last like manual transmission cars you can get, I was like, oh, I'm so excited about this. Like, this is really speaking to me. I'll do the math and see if I can afford it. And my heart's like, do it. And my bank account was like, yeah, you could, but maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I never end up, biting or like pulling the trigger on something like that is because, like, for me, the best car is the car that's paid for, which is my current Golf. I have no debt on it. It's cheap to run.
Yeah.
It's so reliable. So, like, I'm going to drive it until it's dead.
Yeah. Now, and I guess that's a good point, although I think it's sort of secondary, is like, no matter what, unless you're just like absolutely swimming in cash and you just don't care, the head-based decision that supersedes them all is, financial. Like, can you afford this vehicle? And if the answer is no, or kind of like maybe, then it's probably not a good idea. And that means whether you're making an emotional purchase or a sensible one, make sure that you can afford it, and make sure. And we are going to do the next episode. So after this one, we're going to do one about kind of demystifying vehicle finance decisions. But like, sit down and make sure that it's not going to break the bank, and it's not going to be like, oh, I'm paying it off for 10 years and I'm rolling over negative equity from my last vehicle to make this one work. So like, the head-based decision that you should always make is like, I need a vehicle and I can afford to buy it. And then from there, if it's your primary vehicle, make sure you're buying the one that makes the most sense for the most applications in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, exactly. If you go to a cottage once a year, that's not a good enough reason to get a huge SUV or a huge truck.
Even like a friend, I won't name names because I just don't want to make it seem
another
like,
Jeff?
No, I wish it was, actually. Maybe that'll be the pseudonym this time. So this guy, Jeff, no, but I do have a friend who, he had bought his first house. So he had a condo, and then he bought a detached home, and there was just some stuff that needed to be cleaned up, and the garage, the old owners had left some stuff in there, so he needed to clear it out, and borrowed his parents' F-150. And afterwards, he was like, oh, man, I think I might buy a Tacoma. And I was like, oh, why? And he goes, well, dump runs and that sort of thing.
How often do you do that?
Exactly. And he's not a handy guy at all. So I said, I tried to reason with him and be like, dude, you're not like doing renos, and you can leave your like bags of leaves and yard waste at the curbside so that it gets picked up, once a week or whatever. I'm like, this doesn't make sense for you. And I'm like, you're commuting further now for work. Tacoma is like miserable on gas,
right.
Even the new one. So I'm like, why would you make that decision because of one single use case? Again, now that the Maverick's here, if he were to have that discussion with me today, I would be like, yeah, you know what? Here's a truck that makes a lot of sense for you. But I think it's a very common sort of pitfall for a lot of people.
I think so too, because it's so emotional, right? Yeah. And this happens not just in our car decisions, but day to day. Our heart speaks very, very loudly sometimes, and it's hard to ignore, right? Yeah. But there are some risks, I think, with prioritizing your emotions over like the practical stuff.
Yes.
Like what are the risks of following your heart during a car buying decision? Like overpaying for something, I think is a big one. Yeah. Buying like too much car for what you actually need is going to cost you a lot more in the long run. Yeah. And I don't think people really look at things in the long run.
No. And then, the other risk is, and again, because it's the whole heart-based decision, looking at stuff like performance, right? It's like suddenly your fuel bills are likely going to increase because you've bought, something that just burns more gas because of what it is, and then likely needs premium grade gas. I always say that to people. The number one thing, if there was one piece of advice for car shopping in general that I would say to someone is, well, you have following the manufacturer's recommended, fuel is a must. Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, it can void your warranty if you're running regular in a car that calls for. Now, sometimes, and we've done this discussion before, but sometimes it says premium recommended, and other times it says premium required. If you're driving a vehicle that requires premium and you go, I'm just going to save a few bucks, you're taking a big risk. But that, again, is one of those, the risks involved with shopping with your heart and not your head is all of a sudden you're going to go, oh, man, like my fuel bills have gone up by 25%.
Yeah, or
overnight.
Even maintenance. Like people don't really think about maintenance. Like, it would be great to buy a new BMW, but then you'll have to pay BMW maintenance fees, right?
Tires,
which is nuts.
Tires are another thing that become more expensive when you're driving a performance vehicle, or even a kind of adventurous vehicle. All-terrain tires. Now, this is the difference, right? If you buy, let's just use a Ford Mustang as an example, right? Yeah, you could run just regular all seasons, but if you want to get the most out of that vehicle, you're going to want to run performance tires, street performance tires. Same thing goes with any sort of adventurous vehicle. If it's on all-terrain tires, in all likelihood, you are going to replace those with all-terrain tires. They're often more expensive because they serve a purpose. They're designed for one thing in mind. And if you guys look, this isn't, being judgmental, but the number of like lifted Jeeps that you see on these bald tires, it's dangerous to run them down to this like level where they're virtually slicks. But it's because it's like that's all, people don't want to all of a sudden shell out $500 per tire.
It's expensive
for these like 32s that they need to put on. So, those are the risks involved with it, but I also understand the reward that comes with it. I think, Jodi, your biggest, best point in the whole thing is like, if it's a second vehicle, fill your boots.
Yeah, because then you don't need it to fulfill those like practical uses day to day. Yeah. If you have the extra cash and you want a fun toy, do it.
Yeah.
Buy to your heart's content. Do something fun. Buy something silly. You can afford it at that point, right? But how annoying would it be to commute to work every day in like a little sports car?
Well, if you look at Dustin Woods, good friend of ours, and when we worked together, he had a Mustang, and he's had like 4 or 5 Mustangs over the years. But then he bought a new motorcycle, and the Mustang, he wasn't driving it very often. And he realized, like, you know what? I need to say goodbye. It's not worth it. Sort of the same thing that happened to me. I used to have a first-gen Mazda Miata, and I loved that car. I had wanted one since I was a kid, and I bought it. And then, with the pandemic hitting, any chance I had to go drive on a weekend or in the evenings, instead of driving the Miata, I would be like, well, I should really get more time behind the wheel of the press car that I'm testing that week. And so it was just kind of languishing in my garage. And I went, you know what? Somebody else needs to take over
and enjoy this because I can't.
And that's one of those, it's a tough decision to make because obviously that was an emotional purchase, but I also had a daily driver. Not even before I had joined Trader, I was working at Subaru Canada. I had an Outback. That was my daily driver. And then the Miata was my fun, weekend car. But I was like, I gotta get rid of it because it just doesn't make sense anymore. And Dustin did the same thing with his Mustang. And now he bought a Tacoma, which makes sense for him because he has a boat that he, likes to tow and go on these kind of cool boating adventures around Ontario. So it makes a lot of sense for him to have a truck. But I also respect the fact that he bought a mid-sized truck because he lives in a condo downtown, and a full size would be a little bit of a problem for him. So he went with something that could still pull tons of weight.
Yep.
But it fits his everyday life better than an F-150 would.
Oh, totally. And it's a manual, right? Which was really important to him. So, now if he wants to go for a rip and a fun thing, he can take his motorcycle.
Yeah.
Like, that's
he was
totally
also
fine.
so patient with that purchase. He really took his time to decide what made sense. And that, again, is if you have the time, if you're not in desperate need to replace your vehicle, I would say go that Dustin route of really, and if it's your lone vehicle, you don't have room for another one or it just doesn't make sense financially, really take your time, be patient, and think what makes the most sense for my life. And that ultimately is going to be beneficial every day.
Yeah, and you're going to be so thankful by how much easier your life has become when you have the right tool for the right job.
Absolutely.
And that if you leave here today with one thing, that's the thing I want you to leave here today with. Think about the right tool for the right job. And how often do you do that job?
Yeah, well, and it's sort of like what I had said to that guy going back to the Golf R steering wheel and wear gloves when you're at a track day. As I said to him, imagine you wanted to go for a casual bike ride. Imagine you were like, it's a nice Saturday in the summertime, and I'm gonna go for a ride to get some ice cream. So you throw on your spandex biking gear and your Aero helmet and your clip-in shoes for a casual
15-minute
exactly.
ride.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And that's sort of on a big picture level, the same thing with a vehicle. Buying a car that is frustrating when you go to load it with groceries or your hockey bag, or, for you, if you're, I don't know, let's say you're antiquing somewhere and you've bought this car that you're like, oh man, I have nowhere to put this stuff that I just bought.
And it's happened to me before when I've had press cars. It's so silly because I'll be driving a 911 and I'm like, well, I have this massive piece of furniture to fit in there. And it's resting on the shelf, on the parcel shelf.
But that's the thing, right? Is I always try. And that's why I bought the Golf wagon, because it was I went from the Outback and I was like, what makes sense for my life? But that I also still like, because I do understand that is there's always going to be a little bit of emotion
of course
in that purchase, because to your point, it's a representation of you and your personality. So I was like, well, you know what? The Golf wagon is it's similar enough to the Outback, but it's also got its own thing going on, diesel, manual, it checks boxes. And that is one of those cars that is I could sleep in it going camping. I can load it with all kinds of stuff. It's efficient, but it's still fun to drive. So you don't always have to compromise and sacrifice the emotional side of it, but you shouldn't let that lead the charge, especially if it's your only vehicle.
Right. And especially if it comes to something like a minivan. Okay, maybe you don't feel cool driving a minivan. Maybe get it in a fun color, or get something.
Or a little self-deprecation goes a long way. I saw a minivan last weekend and it had a little sticker on the back window that said, "I used to be cool."
I love that. You see?
I thought it was cute and fun. It makes other people smile. And it's kind of like how I have those stickers on the side of my car that look like, racing sponsors, but it's bread, eggs,
milk.
ham, milk, bananas, silly stuff. because I was like, well, this is the ultimate grocery getter, right? And it's like and the number of, like, it's such a conversation starter in traffic. People are always laughing and giving me thumbs up and taking photos. And I'm like, that's fun that you can take something that wagons aren't, I would say they're not far off from minivans where people either really love them or they get derided as uncool. But it's like when you can kind of like, take that power away from people.
Totally.
And that's what I think for minivans.
Have a laugh about it.
Exactly. You could do the same thing with your van, own it, and then there's no shame in driving it.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing about minivans. So Sung Kang of Fast and Furious fame, big car guy, right?
No idea who that is.
Because you've never seen the Fast and Furious. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, big car guy, huge in car culture. He loves his Sienna. He has a Sienna and will not stop talking about how cool he is with it and how cool he feels driving it and how practical it is.
Minivans are sweet.
It's great. Also, sliding doors. If you have kids and you're worried about dinging people's doors, I cannot stress enough how much of a game changer sliding doors are.
Instantly, you don't have to worry or park at the far end of the parking lot. It
removes that anxiety entirely for you and your kids. Yeah. Anyway, before our Ask an Expert, here is a message from your friends at AutoTrader. Having trouble finding your perfect car at the perfect price? The answer is AutoTrader. Car prices are dropping across Canada, and AutoTrader has hundreds of thousands of new and used cars to choose from. Get a great deal on your perfect car by visiting AutoTrader today. So today's Ask an Expert comes from Sebastian.
Oh, Seb.
So he made a submission for our Hot Takes episode about how hypercars, supercars, and most sports cars are an unethical waste of money and resources, was his hot take.
I had said, but he's a big F1 fan.
Yes, and so he had a response to your question.
I think I'd asked him.
In person?
No, on that episode. I went, Seb, I know you're going to be listening to this, so why don't you submit an answer? So
and he totally did. Yeah. He emailed expert@trader.ca with his answer. So here's what he said.
Okay.
You're asking me if the sport whose whole thing is burning planet-killing fuel to literally go in a circle is unethical? You're asking if the sport that regularly consorts with some of the worst people on Earth and some of the most human rights abuse-happy countries on Earth is morally compromised? You're asking me if the sport whose whole purpose is to encourage the overconsumption of personal vehicles at the expense of more efficient, more egalitarian, and oftentimes faster modes of transportation is a little iffy? Yeah, my dudes, F1 is bad. I like watching cars go vroom, but you won't catch me defending it. My hottest take of all is that enjoying something isn't always a good reason to hold on to it.
Fair point. Yeah. That was kind of what I was getting at with the question, right? Is sometimes you're the things in life. It's the same thing. I've become more aware of, my environmental impact and driving and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I know it's such a big part of this job, but I'm like, sometimes it feels a little unnecessary. And I do like to kind of cut down on my impact where I can. Mm-hmm. Obviously it's minuscule, but I also don't see that as, an excuse, right? That argument of why should we look at country A and we barely, contribute to climate change. It's but every little bit helps.
Everyone's got to do their part, even if it is a little thing. Exactly. I think if everyone's doing little thing, it adds up.
Yeah, but that's not to say, and I think motorsports has an opportunity with e-fuels and electrification to change a bit and be leaders for a kind of greater good. But yeah, I mean, it is funny to think about it that way.
I mean, it is. I mean, he's laid it out for you. He loves F1, but there's a lot wrong with it too. And I think it's okay to live in that gray zone for some things.
Sure, totally. Yeah. So anyways, Seb, we appreciate your response. You're telling expert, let's say.
Yes.
And yeah, like I said earlier, next episode, we're going to talk about, leasing and financing and the differences and what you should think about. So that'll also be a sort of back to the basics episode.
Amazing. Then drive safe and we'll see you next time.